Unwoo watched the assassin before her, and she wondered if this was how her life ended. Her humiliating life flashed before her eyes, and in the blink of an eye, the assassin leaped towards her as claws sprang from his fingertips. She squeezed her eyes shut, ready to accept her end, but suddenly a loud crash had them springing open once again. And before her stood Bequi, and at his feet lay the dead assassin. Tears pooled in her eyes at the sight of him, and he smirked as he noted, "So you didn't really want to die." He approached and gently swiped at the splattered blood on her face, as he wondered if she was afraid now that death was upon her. But Unwoo grew annoyed at the man's smug attitude and, in an act of pretentiousness, stated, "I'd just changed my mind." At her surprising words, Bequi burst into laughter, and Unwoo wondered about his sudden appearance. The atmosphere shifted suddenly, and Bequi, once again, reminded her of his words, of the danger she was now in. In a flash, Bequi drew his sword and slashed at the flying assailant, striking him down as if to reinforce his words. Unwoo jumped back in fright, but Bequi held a hand out to her, ready to whisk her away before more trouble arrived. Unwoo hesitated, and Bequi raised a brow skeptically as he wondered if she truly trusted him. But after a moment, she grabbed at Bequi's outstretched hand, and she looked at him with determination in her eyes. "I'll go with you," she said. Bequi smiled in satisfaction as he pulled her close, an action that startled Unwoo, and his next words left Unwoo perplexed as he said, "I'll show you something interesting." But Unwoo was soon startled as she found herself atop the large tiger she'd first encountered. And when he whipped forward, his pace steadily increasing, Unwoo grasped a hold of his mane for dear life. She looked back with some struggle, surprised to find that they'd already put a lot of distance between them and the palace. And as she watched the palace shrink more and more, a feeling of dread overcame her as she wondered if this was the end to everything she'd held close to her heart. They continued at a steady canter, and Unwoo's heart felt as though it would burst with excitement as she took in the splendid scenery, something she'd not thought possible, confined in the dreary palace walls. She leaned closer, snuggling deeper into Bequi's coat as she let the scent and the sounds of the forest and the night encase her in a cocoon of comfort, something close to a feeling that she'd felt long ago, the warm feeling of her mother's loving embrace. And while Unwoo made her way to freedom, back at the palace, the man entered Unwoo's residence, taking in the many corpses that scattered the floor. He sighed as he ordered his men to clean the place up. And although he'd ordered otherwise, he'd somewhat expected the assassins to cause quite a racket. And not so far off, Jiamyong made sure to stay hidden, trembling in terror as she observed the man who possessed shrewd eyes. Back at Mount Wang, Gongpil rushed to his lord as soon as he appeared, but stopped short at the sight, for in Bequi's arms lay a sleeping Unwoo. And once inside, Bequi gently laid her down, and from behind him, Gongpil studied the human woman with curious eyes. She'd appeared different than what Gongpil had expected, for he'd imagined a bigger, sturdier woman, unlike the delicate, somewhat pale creature before him. But soon, Gongpil jumped back in trepidation as his master's aura turned menacing. He quickly assured Bequi that his words were said absent-mindedly. Bequi waved him off, ready to be done with their conversation, but inquisitive eyes stopped him. And his next question surprised Bequi the most. "Will you spend the night together?" Gongpil questioned. Bequi frowned as his anger rose at Gongpil's intrusive questioning, but he explained before Bequi unleashed his fury upon him. "The 100-day purification ritual," Gongpil announced. It was a ritual held by the tribes, whereby the body should remain pure without any union, and if broken, it was believed a proper marriage would not be blessed. Therefore, the engagement would become void. Gongpil reminded Bequi of the ancient ritual and about the most important thing of all. If the ritual was broken, one would fall gravely ill and would meet their death. Bequi reminded Gongpil that while he was a beast by nature, he still had morals and wouldn't assault a sleeping woman. But it wasn't the woman Gongpil was worried about, but in fact it was his master, since Gongpil's idea of the lady was that of the domineering type. He was worried she might not be aware of the purification ritual and might stake her claim over Bequi. Bequi looked away as thoughts, unbidden, entered his mind thanks to Gongpil's words, and Gongpil smiled in satisfaction, for his master wore his thoughts like a cloak. And with that he bid his master a good night and left. And once alone, Bequi sat beside the sleeping woman. He watched her with a keen eye, and he wondered about the trust she placed in him since she slept unaware and defenseless. He put out the light and lay beside Unwoo, and as he got closer, he noted her delicate features. He was sure that if given the chance, he would swallow her in one bite, but then she'd disappear, and Bequi frowned at the thought. He drew even closer and smiled, having come to a decision. He would accept Unwoo as his companion. But he was drawn out of his thoughts as Unwoo turned over, still asleep, and in her shuffling, her jiggery came undone, revealing smooth skin. Bequi jumped back at the unexpected sight and almost lost his mind. In an instant, he loomed over the unaware lady, reigning in his beastly urges. He would control himself, he promised. He repeated the mantra over and over again, and once he'd calmed down, he deflated as all strength left his body. Back at the palace, the man with cunning eyes sat opposite Prince Gwangmyeong. The prince laughed a boisterous laugh as he noted that the man had gone to save the princess himself, an action the prince couldn't understand since he saw Princess Wahan as nothing more than a disposable pawn. The man smiled at the prince as he stated that everything went according to their plan and soon Prince Gwangmyeong would ascend to the throne, unchallenged. But the man questioned if the prince still wanted to continue on the difficult path to the throne when a simple, easy way lay out before them: the assassination of the crown prince. Prince Gwangmyeong had the power to do it with his current backing, but the prince stated simply, "I wish to be a sage king." He said firmly that he would take the throne without bloodshed since enough of it had already stained their history. The man observed the prince silently, his thoughts concealed. They would proceed with using the ruined princess to dispose the crown prince. The man smiled as he assured Prince Gwangmyeong that soon, the crown prince, Princess Wahan, and the ill king would be in the palm of their hands. But as he stepped out, the man's smile slid off his face, and his eyes turned sharp as he thought about Prince Gwangmyeong and their plans ahead. He found humans to be utterly mysterious since the prince chose the hard way to go about things. He grinned slyly, for how they got there mattered not, so long as he achieved his ultimate goal, to trample the aristocracy, leaving an open pathway for commoners to take the reins. As the man walked away, concealed in the darkness, a man watched him leave Prince Gwangmyeong's palace. Back at Mount Wang, the gossip had spread like wildfire. They spoke of their lord that had spent a night with a woman, and they wondered if he'd broken his chastity, but one man assured the rest that Gongpil was present, so there was no need to worry. But with the appearance of their master's woman, they felt the need to step in, since this concerned the well-being of their nation. Unwoo opened her eyes, and instantly, she came face to face with Bequi. She exclaimed loudly at his smiling face, "What are you doing? You scoundrel!" Bequi took offense to Unwoo's rude name-calling since he was in fact the person that had helped her. But Unwoo backed away, face flushed as she covered her eyes and wondered about Bequi's lack of clothing. He looked down at his bare chest, sure he'd covered enough of himself since he usually wore even less. Unwoo blushed even harder at Bequi's words, and upon seeing her reaction, conceded to cover up more as a courtesy to her. Bequi stood and attempted to fix his robe under the scrutinizing eyes of Unwoo, and she wondered how she came to be in this situation. She recalled the past events of her night before and flushed a deep red as she realized that she'd fallen asleep at the end of it all, and soundly at that too. She looked around, surprised to find herself in an actual room and not in the bushes where she'd assumed tigers stayed. But her eyes soon fell on Bequi and the lovely image he made. Her face still flushed, Bequi took that moment to look down at her, and after a moment more, smiled as he noted the look of regret reflected in Eunwoo's eyes. He crouched closer as Eunwoo denied his words, and Bequi's knees went weak at her ardent denial, his own face flushing in embarrassment. He suggested a walk, and as they left his quarters, a cadre of maids greeted them with bowed heads, ready to be of service. Eunwoo wondered if all at the Wang palace were tigers, but Bequi's voice pulled her from her thoughts as he explained that yesterday's incident was the work of the Leopard clan. They'd had a long-standing grudge against the Tiger clan. They also had an exceptional sense of smell, and that was probably how they'd found her. Bequi was unsure of their intentions, but what was certain was they'd already settled into the palace. They'd caught his mark on her and targeted her, and for that reason, he'd brought her to Mount Wang. He looked back, his words trailing off as he took in Eunwoo's odd face as she caught sight of the view before her. She vaguely wondered if she'd stepped foot in the land of the gods, for such a paradise surely couldn't exist on their land. Bequi stepped closer, a gentle smile gracing his lips as he watched the open wonderment on Eunwoo's face. And watching her, Bequi felt that his life going forward would never be the same again. But an unexpected voice spoke up behind him, and he froze. It was Elder Jiho of the Elders' Council and Wanho, the eldest member of said council. Bequi frowned and let loose a heavy sigh, for he knew what the Elder Council members wanted from him. And the sparkle in their eyes said as much. But their eyes soon turned cunning as Elder Wanho stated, "I'm incredibly happy to see the day when our Lord takes a partner before I leave for my eternal rest." Eunwoo caught the hidden meaning of their words and smiled uneasily. Bequi introduced Eunwoo to the elders of the Tiger clan, and Eunwoo bowed gracefully, an act that came as naturally as breathing to her. And when she smiled at the old men, they gaped in shock at the splendid sight of Princess Wahan. And in that moment, they determined Eunwoo to be the perfect match for their lord. They slumped in apparent relief, for finally, after 10 years of ascending to the throne of their clan, their lord had found a lady fit to be at his side. And with a glance at each other, they came to an agreement. They turned to Bequi as they asked about their preferred date, and Eunwoo looked at the elders in confusion. The wedding date, of course, Elder Wanho answered with an indulgent smile. Eunwoo paled as she realized they'd meant her wedding, and she looked up to Bequi for help, but he offered nothing but a smile. But before anyone said a word more, Eunwoo stated with a clear voice, "There seems to be a misunderstanding. I'm already betrothed." At her words, the men gaped at Eunwoo in shock. The men looked at Eunwoo, aghast at what she'd said, but the most shocked of all was Bequi. The elders left the two alone, and once alone, a frown marred Bequi's face, and Eunwoo was sure that he was upset with her. But why would he be when they were nothing more than acquaintances? She thought. "Had you not asked me if I'd marry you?" Bequi asked her, and Eunwoo looked at him in confusion. She frowned and looked away, appalled that Bequi would think her desperate enough to propose marriage to another man so easily. Bequi wanted to know the name of her fiancé, but Eunwoo didn't know as well. Her answer surprised Bequi, and by the forlorn look on her face, he determined that Eunwoo had had no choice in the matter. He spoke his thoughts aloud, and Eunwoo looked up, surprised. "Then how about me?" Bequi questioned. Why should she marry some stranger when she could marry him instead? Again, Bequi surprised her with his words as he noted that they were already entangled in a bond that couldn't be undone. And so Bequi gave Eunwoo a choice. All she had to do was choose him, and he would take care of everything else. Bequi smiled down at her, and Eunwoo looked at him in awe at the endless well of confidence that he possessed. He truly exuded the aura of a leader, and Eunwoo saw it in every action and gesture. She felt drawn to him. A court lady interrupted them as she announced breakfast was ready, and Bequi suggested they finish their conversation after they'd had their meal. But soon Eunwoo stood mouth agape at the spread before her, for what she thought was a simple meal was a meal truly fit for a king. Bequi took a seat and patted the one beside him, motioning her to join him with a smile, and yet again Eunwoo was left flabbergasted. It was well known that even the king, who stood above all, did not share a table with anyone. But Bequi explained that in their clan, women weren't discriminated against. Positions were determined not by gender, but by ability. Satisfied, he patted the seat once more and ordered, "Now eat." Unwoo conceded, albeit reluctantly, since it went against the etiquette she was taught. She was sure that the longer she stayed, the more lines would be blurred. Bequi watched her with a warm gaze, and he noted that while the food might not suit her palate, he hoped she'd eat more. His eyes fell to her neck, now exposed, and he noted how thin she was. Unwoo thanked him, and as she took her first bite, her eyes widened in wonder as the delicious food burst on her tongue. Bequi watched her with keen eyes as she stated how delightful the food was, and he piled more on her plate, eager to see more of her joy. But soon Unwoo fussed at the amount of food, and Bequi said, "I wasn't sure what you'd like, so I hoped there would be something you enjoyed." Unwoo now realized that the spread before them was his consideration for her, and she blushed at having someone care for her so thoroughly. Once done, they'd moved to an open pavilion, and now Unwoo watched the koi fish quietly, a stark contrast to the mess of thoughts in her mind. She was sure if she stayed, she'd be able to live as herself and not as Princess Wahan, a scorned royal. It was a place without pain and oppression. It was paradise. A sweet aroma pulled her eyes down, and a fragrant tea was set before her. She looked at it questioningly, and Bequi explained that the flowers were picked with careful consideration, for if not, they wouldn't be as fragrant and flavorful. He was sure she'd like it, and at his words, Unwoo looked down, a small smile spreading across her face. She recalled the times she'd sat with her court ladies for tea time, a time that she'd sorely missed recently with the sudden mention of the royal wedding. And she knew in her heart that she couldn't leave behind the people most precious to her. Her face an open book, Bequi easily guessed that Unwoo considered going back, and after a moment, she stated simply, "Yes." Bequi explained the dangers of returning, that assassins would visit her both night and day. And so he questioned once more if she was sure about her decision. But Unwoo needn't answer because Bequi smiled a confident smile as he stated, "I'll let you go." He promised Unwoo a safe return, and she looked at him, perplexed at his easy acceptance. He leaned forward as he explained that he'd not given up. No, he was simply biding his time, waiting for Unwoo to make the right decision, and that was to marry him. His persistence left Unwoo stumped, and before she could say a word, he told her he wouldn't be sending her back alone. Chanhua appeared as though from thin air and kneeled down as she presented herself. She was to serve Unwoo at Bequi's order. "It's an honor to serve you," Chanhua said politely. After some brief introductions, Unwoo left, and Bequi watched their retreating figures before Gongpil pulled him from his thoughts. Gongpil looked to be on the verge of tears from the little gossip he'd heard that the lady was already to be married. Bequi clicked his tongue. He was sure those elders had already spread word of it. He ordered Gongpil to find out who Unwoo's fiancé was, but Gongpil was sure it would be a difficult task indeed, since even the parties involved remained anonymous. But Bequi had had enough of his whining as he questioned, "Can't you do it?" Gongpil paled as he realized his master had reached the end of his patience and quickly promised to have some news by the end of the day. He sped off, hoping to complete the impossible task on time, and Bequi sat, lost in thought. It annoyed him that a pest had shown up just as he'd found his partner, and a thought crossed his mind, a simple solution. Should he just kill the man? Unwoo made her way back to the palace, Chanhua at her side. She looked down at the clothes she'd changed into, a beautifully crafted hanbok, and she recalled Bequi explaining that he'd prepared new clothes for her since her old clothes were in tatters. She glanced furtively at the guard assigned to her, Chanhua, curious since she'd never seen a female guard before. She turned to Chanhua once more and introduced herself with a graceful smile once again. But Chanhua remained impassive as she asked Unwoo to use informal speech with her. Unwoo agreed easily, and they continued on their way, but as they walked in silence, Unwoo couldn't shake the tension that surrounded them like a fog. She arrived at her palace, and her court ladies rushed to her side, fraught with worry. She assured the two ladies that she was fine, and after a moment, they turned their attention to the new face at their lady's side. Unwoo introduced Chanhua as her guard and explained that she'd be living with them going forward. Chanhua told Unwoo that she only needed to call out to her to summon her, for she'd stay by her side like a shadow. And with those words, she darted away faster than their eyes could see. Jiamyong frowned at Chanhua's rude behavior, and she wondered if they could trust the newcomer. But Unwoo brushed Jiamyong's worry off, and as they made their way inside, Unwoo was stunned to see her palace in pristine condition. Jiamyong explained that a man with tasseled earrings appeared with a group of men, and they'd quickly cleaned the place up. Jiamyong explained that she was the only one to see the coming and going of the group, and her words alarmed Unwoo. If Jiamyong was the only witness and they'd made sure to erase any trace of themselves or their attempted assassination, Unwoo wondered if they'd truly only found her by scent alone. Or was there someone else playing puppet master behind the scenes? She recalled the crown prince's words about Prince Gwangmyeong and wondered if these incidents were linked. Court Lady Mun called out to her, worried about her safety, and Unwoo took a moment to collect her thoughts. She felt conflicted about just how much she could share without worrying them. The court ladies looked at each other, their lady's distress evident, and Court Lady Mun clasped Unwoo's hand gently as she assured the princess that she didn't need to share if it was something they shouldn't be privy to. She smiled at their consideration, but their moment was interrupted as another court lady approached. She relayed her message. Her Majesty has requested your presence and is awaiting your arrival.